Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Families of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a female network of power in the Middle Ages, by J.F. Andrews, narrated by Jennifer M. Dixon. Introduction. Eleanor of Aquitaine. In early 1137, William X, the widowed Duke of Aquitaine, was planning to go on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in the Spanish kingdom of Leon. Like any long-distance travel, this undertaking was a risky one, so he needed to ensure that he made arrangements both for the duration of his absence and for the possibility that he might not return. He had no son, but two daughters, Eleanor, then aged around 14 or 15, and Petronilla, who was probably 11 or 12. Until such time as William might return, remarry, and father a legitimate son, Eleanor was the heir to Aquitaine, and she needed to be placed under the protection of a powerful guardian, lest anyone should seek to gain the duchy by marrying her against her father's will. William confided both his daughters to the care of the man who was nominally his overlord, King Louis VI of France, and they were sent to the castle of Bordeaux for safekeeping. Duke William died on his pilgrimage, meaning that no future male heir could supplant Eleanor, and overnight she became the richest marriage prize in Western Europe. King Louis took the obvious course of action and immediately dispatched his son and heir, the 17-year-old Louis the Young, south to marry her. The wedding took place on the 25th of July, 1137, bride and groom having almost certainly never met before. This was, of course, not unusual for royal couples, whose marriages were not matters of personal preference, but rather arrangements centred on lands and dynastic concerns. Louis VI, who had been ill for some time, died just a week after the wedding, meaning that his son ascended the French throne as Louis VII, and Eleanor, after a whirlwind 6 months, was not only Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, but also Queen of France by virtue of her marriage. The royal relationship would go on to experience much upheaval, with the pious Louis complaining of Eleanor's vivacious behaviour, while she in turn felt that she had married a monk, not a king. The situation was compounded by the lack of an all-important male heir for the French crown. After 13 years of marriage, Eleanor had borne just 2 daughters, Marie, born 1145, and Alix, born 1150. And no son. A difficult decision lay ahead for Louis, who was by that time 30 and had the question of the succession hanging heavily on his mind. Divorce and remarriage might give him the chance to father a son to continue his royal dynasty, but he would lose the rich Duchy of Aquitaine, which would stay with Eleanor as Duchess in her own right. Eventually the concerns of the French crown won out, and the marriage was dissolved on the 21st of March, 1152, officially on the grounds of consanguinity. Divorce, in the sense that we now understand it, was not permitted. The only option was annulment, which theoretically meant that the parties had never been married in the first place, because their union was invalid. This had implications for any children, but Marie and Alix were declared legitimate by the Church on the slightly fudged reasoning that the parties had originally entered into the marriage in good faith. Custody of them was granted without question to Louis. Children were legally the property of their father. With Aquitaine as a prize, Eleanor had no shortage of suitors for a second match, but she evaded all offers and several kidnap attempts so that she could marry the man of her own choice. He was Henry of Anjou, Duke of Normandy and claimant to the English throne, later to be Henry II. They were married in Poitiers on the 18th of May, 1152, just 8 weeks after the annulment of Eleanor's marriage to Louis. Louis was, understandably, furious. If Eleanor were to bear Henry a son, the French king's elder daughter, Marie, would lose her status as the heiress to Aquitaine, which he would have hoped to control in her name in due course. The union also linked Aquitaine with Normandy and potentially England as well, an intimidating prospect for a French king who exercised direct control over only a small part of his kingdom and who needed to be wary of overmighty vassals. Louis's fear was soon to be realized as, making a mockery of French criticism of her fertility, Eleanor and her second husband started a family very quickly. Their short-lived firstborn, William, 1153 to 1156, was followed by Henry, born 1155, Matilda, born 1156, Richard, born 1157, Geoffrey, born 1158, Leonor, born 1161, Joanna, born 1165, and John, born 1166. None of Eleanor's children were born in Aquitaine, despite the fact that she was Duchess there for more than 60 years. Instead, their birthplaces of England, Normandy, and Anjou showcase the huge agglomeration of lands over which she and Henry ruled. This makes it a little more difficult to refer to the children of this marriage as being English or Angevin. In the same way that Marie and Alex can safely be called French, so for the purposes of this book I will call them Plantagenet, even though they did not use the surname themselves. Eleanor's children were her family, but they were not a family in the sense that we might understand the word now. Never, not once in her long life, was Eleanor in the same place at the same time as all of her children, nor indeed even with all the children of her second marriage. A 12th century royal family was not a close-knit group of people with emotional ties who lived together. Rather, it was a political and strategic unit in which each member was expected to act in order to bring advantage to the whole, regardless of their own personal feelings. Marriages for members of the family were of crucial importance. Peace treaties might depend on them, and valuable international alliances might be sealed by them. This worked both ways, so the wives of Eleanor's sons coming into the family were just as important in dynastic terms as her own daughters marrying out of it. Indeed, arguably more so, as they would, it was hoped, ensure continuation of the male line. This is why Eleanor's daughters-in-law are included in this book, along with her daughters. They were Margaret of France, born 1158, married to Henry; Berengaria of Navarre, born circa 1165, married to Richard; Constance of Brittany, born 1161, married to Geoffrey; and Isabel of Gloucester, born circa 1160, and Isabella of Angoulême, born circa 1188, both married to John. Eleanor's own daughters were all sent away at very young ages to be brought up in the homelands of their intended husbands. It is probable that Eleanor did not have much say in their destinations. However, it is equally probable that she approved of the high status of the husbands in question, and that she would not have wanted her daughters to make inferior marriages simply in order for them to stay near to her. In the normal course of events, these unions between different kingdoms and the distances involved meant that Eleanor would not really have expected ever to see her daughters again, though they would certainly have anticipated corresponding. No letters between Eleanor and her daughters survive, but that does not mean there were none. Royal women engaged in frequent correspondence. Henry II would certainly have kept in touch with the husbands he had arranged for his daughters, for an alliance would be of little use if the parties never communicated. As it transpired, however, fate would bring Eleanor into close contact with all three of her daughters by Henry II as the years passed, and she would have widely varying personal relationships with her daughters-in-law. She had much less interaction with her daughters by Louis, though they also formed part of the strategic web that would influence the course of events in France and England, and further afield, throughout the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The lives of the 10 women featured in this book spanned almost exactly a century, from the birth of Marie in 1145 to the death of Isabella in 1246. Between them, they would form a great international network of political alliances that linked their siblings, their husbands, and their children. Their stories stretch from England to the Holy Land, from Spain to Sicily, from France to Hungary, thus giving them a combined sphere of influence that extended across many kingdoms and thousands of miles, while the actions of each influenced the lives of the others even across great distances. None of them had a say in the choice of their first husbands, but they all took on the challenge of carving out a life and a position for themselves, some in unpredictable ways, and all with differing degrees of success. Some of them found happiness, others endured lives of turmoil and conflict. Some of them had close relationships, others never met. But 2 things linked them all: their connection to Eleanor and the kingdoms over which she reigned, and their determination to exert authority on their own terms in a male-dominated world. Part 1. Daughters of France. 1. Marie and Alix. In the spring of 1145, King Louis and Queen Eleanor of France had been married for 7.5 years. No child had been born to them in all that time, and hopes were fading for a royal heir. But Eleanor had at last conceived, and despite all the potential dangers, she had carried the pregnancy to term. She was now confined, literally shut into the room with her female attendants, as was the custom at the time, and news was expected any day. Finally, a message from the birthing chamber reached the king, but it was not the one he had hoped for. In one respect, of course, the labour had been a success, in that both mother and baby had survived, but in another it was a catastrophic failure, because the new arrival was not the all-important and much-anticipated son, but a daughter. Marie, known as Marie of France, and sometimes later as Marie of Champagne, was Eleanor's firstborn. A child had been long desired, but this little girl was not exactly treasured by either of her parents, and was not destined to have the sort of close and loving relationship with them that a modern miracle baby, born after years of childlessness, might expect. She was separated from them very early in her life, being barely 2 years old when both her parents left France to embark on what would later be known as the Second Crusade. They would be away for more than 2 years. By the time they returned to France, Louis and Eleanor's relationship had deteriorated to the point where the dissolution of the marriage was openly talked of. The Pope, Eugenius III, was aware of the national and international implications of such a split, and he made a last-ditch attempt to reconcile the couple. He forbade any future mention of their consanguinity, and strove, by friendly converse, to restore love between them. He also, perhaps more pertinently, made them sleep in the same bed, which he had decked with priceless hangings of his own. This intervention saved the marriage in the short term, and even resulted in another pregnancy. It was hoped, certainly by Louis and undoubtedly by many others in France, that this time Eleanor would bear a son. But when she was confined in the summer of 1150, her baby was another girl. They named her Alix and began to make plans to separate. The annulment of Louis and Eleanor's marriage on the grounds of consanguinity, when it occurred on the 21st of March, 1152, did not affect Marie and Alix's position to any great extent. They remained princesses of France, their legitimacy confirmed by the same ecclesiastical council that had been convened to examine the circumstances of the marriage. Nor did the split particularly alter their relationship with their parents. They would see very little of them from now on, but actually that had always been the case, with royal infants being fed and cared for by wet nurses and other women employed for the purpose. When a marriage ended, custody of any children was always the prerogative of the father, and there is some doubt as to whether Eleanor ever saw either of her daughters by Louis again, with the possible exception of a brief meeting with Marie more than 40 years later. Eleanor has sometimes been accused of abandoning Marie and Alex when she left the French royal court, but given the situation, it is difficult to see what else she could have done. They were their father's property in law, and he would have been perfectly entitled to deny Eleanor access to them, even if she had remained in Paris. Meanwhile, Louis was, like most medieval kings, a distant father. If the girls did remain at his court for a while, once Eleanor had left it, he is unlikely to have spent a great deal of time with them personally. Their only consolation, and even this only as long as they remained in Paris, was that they were probably housed together. Eleanor's second marriage to Henry, Duke of Normandy, just weeks after her separation from Louis, and all too obviously the result of a prior arrangement, enraged the French king. He was highly incensed because she had delivered over to the Duke of Normandy the fertile province of Aquitaine, the lawful inheritance, in his opinion, of the daughters he had by the Queen, and he flew to arms and began very violent attacks on the Duke. Louis sought to make alliances against Henry, and these same dispossessed daughters would be the means by which he achieved his aims. In early 1153, Marie and Alex were betrothed, at the ages of 7 and 2, to the brothers Henry I, Count of Champagne, and Theobald V, Count of Blois, who were 25 and 22 respectively. These two men were among France's most powerful nobles. Henry had accompanied King Louis on the Second Crusade as one of his most loyal commanders, and Theobald was shortly to be named Seneschal of France. Their whole family was exceedingly well placed. In addition to Henry and Theobald being two of France's most powerful counts, their other brothers were Stephen, Count of Sancerre, and the cleric William Whitehands, who would go on to become Archbishop of Reims, France's most senior ecclesiastical position. They also had 6 sisters, one a nun at Fontevraud, and others involved in various high-ranking political marriages. Henry and Theobald were also, as it happened, the nephews of King Stephen of England, and therefore not well disposed toward his rival Henry, Duke of Normandy. In connecting the counts to the French royal family through his daughters, Louis hoped, with their help, to profit at the expense of his ex-wife and her new husband, who between them now controlled more of France than he did. It was customary at this time for a child bride to be sent to the lands of her future husband so that she could be brought up and educated in what he considered the most appropriate manner. This is what happened to Marie and Alex, separated now not only from both parents, but also from each other. Marie was dispatched to Champagne, probably to the Abbey of Avonay, and Alex to an unidentified, but no doubt similar foundation in Blois. We should note at this point that being educated in a convent by no means indicated that a child was intended for holy orders. The care of infants of both sexes and of girls as they grew older was considered a female concern, and convents were centres of female literacy. It thus made sense for royal and noble girls, and boys if they were under the age of about 6 or 7, to be educated there, though it was certainly a different and more rigorously academic sort of upbringing from the one that might be supervised by a mother or prospective mother-in-law. We do not have the exact details of Marie and Alex's education, but it would have been substantial, as befitted the daughters of a king. literacy, Latin, religion, training in how to organize and administer a large estate, and a good grounding in politics would all have been included, as well as pursuits that we might consider more traditionally feminine. Noblewomen were expected to be their husbands' able colleagues and deputies, not just the mothers of their children. As they studied and grew up, Marie and Alex's positions in the dynastic and political order shifted. In 1153, the birth of a son to Eleanor and Henry meant that Marie was no longer the heiress to Aquitaine, a blow both to her father and to her intended husband, who might have hoped to rule it in her name one day. In 1154, Eleanor became Queen of England, so the girls found themselves in the unique position of having a crowned parent on both sides of the Channel. In that same year, Louis married again. His bride was Constance of Castile, who was, at the time, somewhere between 14 and 18 years old, and to whom he was actually related, even more closely than he was to Eleanor, which demonstrates that the consanguinity excuse for the annulment was nothing more than a convenient fiction. However, he was again to be disappointed in his quest for a son and heir, as Constance bore him two more daughters, Margaret in 1158 and another Alex, normally referred to as Alice, to avoid confusion, a convention we will follow in this book, in 1160, during which labour Constance died. Louis, now in his 40s and more desperate than ever for a son, married again just 5 weeks after Constance's death, and his choice of wife was to throw the family relationships and the genealogical record into total confusion. His new queen was Adela, sister to Counts Henry of Champagne and Theobald of Blois, the future husbands of Louis's daughters. This meant that the young men would, in due course, be Louis's brothers-in-law as well as his sons-in-law, and Queen Adela would be Marie and Alex's stepmother as well as their sister-in-law. We do not know Adela's exact date of birth, but she was almost certainly still in her teens at the time of the marriage, and thus nearer in age to her stepdaughters than to her husband. The new and complex family situation was cemented in 1164, when the marriages of both sisters took place. Alex was 14, criminally young now, but at the time not an unusual age for a noble girl to be married. Marie was a more mature 19. She had already given her personal and binding consent to her marriage some years previously, when she was 14 or 15, but it seems that it was politically expedient to have both weddings take place at the same time, hence her wait until her sister was considered old enough, by 12th century standards at least, to consummate her union. Marie and Alex now moved from their places of education to take up residence at their husbands' courts, Marie in Troyes and Alex some 130 miles west of her in Chartres. As the king still had no son and Marie was his eldest daughter, Count Henry of Champagne would have been one of the prime candidates to succeed Louis on the French throne had the situation continued thus, though his claim might be contested by the king's younger brother Robert, Count of Dreux, but the prospect of conflict over the crown was avoided when Queen Adela, after what must have been a highly stressful and pressured childless 5 years of marriage, gave birth to a son, Philip, later known as Philip Augustus, in August 1165. There were huge celebrations in the streets of Paris, perhaps motivated by relief as much as joy. A second son, for insurance purposes, was now Louis's goal, but his sixth and final child, born in 1170 when he was 50, was another girl, Agnes. Following Philip's birth and her own consequent demotion in the line of succession, the now 20-year-old Marie's future was more clearly mapped out as the Countess of Champagne, and she soon began a family of her own in order to continue her husband's line. She gave birth to a son and heir, Henry, later Henry II of Champagne, in July 1166, and would go on to have 3 other surviving children, Marie, Scholastica and Theobald. Given the large age gaps between the 4, Theobald was not born until 1179, Marie may have endured stillbirths or infant losses in between, but there are no records either way. Alix also had a family. Tragically, 3 of her 4 sons died young, but the other, Louis, survived, as did 3 daughters, Margaret, Isabel and Alix. It is perhaps worth noting that neither Marie nor Alix called any of their daughters Eleanor, although how much choice they were actually able to exercise in the naming of their children must remain a matter for conjecture. The exigencies of dynastic politics meant that matches were arranged for Marie's children while they were still very young. No marriage alliances between Champagne and Blois could be considered, of course, as the children were closely related to each other twice over, but other proposed unions offered the potential to spread the family network wider. Marie's 2 eldest children, Henry and Marie, were betrothed to Isabel and Baldwin, the 2 children of Count Baldwin V of Hainaut. When Henry was 5, his fiancée Isabel, about 18 months, and Marie and Baldwin, still babies in their cradles. These were matches of great political significance in France, for Baldwin V was not only Count of Hainaut in his own right, but also the heir to prosperous Flanders via his wife, Margaret, who was sister to the childless Count Philip of Flanders. It would appear that Marie and Alix had very little opportunity to see each other during the years of their education and early in their marriages. Alix and Theobald visited Marie and Henry in Troyes at Christmas in 1166, and it is possible that this was the first time the sisters had seen each other since they had been separated 13 years previously. If this was the case, then Alix, who had only been a toddler at that time, can hardly have remembered Marie at all. As with many members of Eleanor of Aquitaine's extended family, Marie and Alix's ties to each other were strong because of their shared blood and their dynastic and political concerns, not because they enjoyed a close personal relationship. By this time, Marie and Alix had a full complement of half-siblings from their mother's second marriage as well as from their father's. Marie, perhaps surprisingly given the complex family circumstances, would become close to the 3 eldest of the Plantagenet brothers, Henry, Richard and Geoffrey. Possibly there was in this an element of compensation for the lack of personal contact with Alix or with any of their French half-siblings during their formative years. Having said that, Marie would later become deeply attached to one of Louis's other daughters through a very strange event. In a confusing arrangement that we will explore more fully in Chapter 5, her paternal half-sister Margaret would marry her maternal half-brother Henry. Henry, known as the Young King because he had been crowned during his father's lifetime in order to secure the succession, a practice common in France but unknown in England either before or since, was, in the early 1170s, actually on better terms with his father-in-law than he was with his own father. He thus spent much of his time in France, either on the tournament circuit as a protégé of Count Philip of Flanders, or at Louis VII's court in Paris. In 1173, his disaffection with Henry II resulted in open rebellion, and he, Richard and Geoffrey, supported by Queen Eleanor, conspired against the English king with the French alliance of King Louis and Counts Henry of Champagne and Theobald of Blois. This put Marie and Alix in the position of having their mother and their father siding together against a common enemy, but it did not result in a personal meeting. Eleanor's 3 sons travelled to Paris, but she remained in Aquitaine. All of them, however, had underestimated Henry II, and he soon put down the revolt, forcing his sons to come to terms and imprisoning his wife. None of Eleanor's older children would see her again for quite some while. While she was Count Henry's consort during the early years of her marriage, Marie was not heavily involved in Champagne's politics or governance, although this would change later. She thus had the time, in between her childbearing duties, to pursue her own interests and to carve out a life of her own, and she became a noted literary patron.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?